Please welcome our friend Kelli Anderson to the Hang Time NYC stage.
Hey everyone, I'm Kelli. What I'm showing behind me is my most recent project I finished up. So this is a papercraft animation about planning a California road trip using web-based software called Dropmark, which was made by the nice guys at Oak Studios. And as a designer, there's historically been these two dual tracks in my work. The first one is that I really like to explain how invisible things work. The activity of data visualization is really all about bringing facts from the abstract or numerical realm into the sphere of perception so you can see and feel and experience those facts. The other part of my work's duality is I'm obsessed with building things that seem like magic but have no hidden parts. Things like this that are really super simple in that you can see their totality, but are complex because they seem to work in ways that are more sophisticated than the sum of their parts. And I like experimenting with this lo-fi magic stuff with objects, but also to create animations. I like working with materials that I can barely control and try to will them into submission. So this, for example, I figured out that I could use my vinyl cutter to make stencils and put those stencils on glass and then cover it with this hydrophobic coating, Rain-X basically. And it's like, because I'm a graphic designer, I'm like, oh, I can make letters this way. Awesome. But then I also started putting them together to make this like experimental animation method. So this is a typical Muybridge moving horse, but it's made out of a puddle of water rather than animation frames. Another recent animation experiment is using the Riso to print animation frames. Is anyone else like obsessed with the Riso in the same way I am? Yes! All right, cool. Yay. The Riso is fun for animation in particular because it has notoriously bad registration, and animation requires perfect registration. So it's like a really interesting sort of transaction to navigate there, where the colors like go wildly out and in of registration. So this is how I've been doing it. I go ahead and print out the frames on the Riso, and they come out all basically looking the same. It seems like no animation is going to happen. But then when you put them together, it comes to life in this really surprising way. And I think the reason that I like these uncontrollable processes is because, you know, I learn a little bit about the world every time I engage with them. It's not something that's just coming from my own head. Here's another one. I've kind of only tried 2 color drums, like I haven't ever changed it. So I'm like, what else can I make with the Riso? But like have not gone beyond the fluorescent orange and blue. This is like a client project for a sneaker company that I'm probably not supposed to be showing you, that I'm finishing up right now. So all of this lo-fi magic stuff, a lot of it exists firmly in this realm of novelty and cheap tricks. Like, you see it once, you realize it's a trick, and you're never fooled again. Kind of like my cat never believed this was a wolf after touching its face. But in these moments, I think when things behave in ways that surprise us, there's an opportunity to get people asking why. So, you know, magic only works when there's a blind spot in our understanding. This here is a book that I made based on research by a Swiss scientist named Emin Gabrielin, which uses moire interference patterns to give the illusion of magnification when a screen is put on dots of the same period and rotated. And it seems to reveal like some kind of like fancy behavior or glitch in the material, but it really just highlights this behavior in our perception that we're otherwise not aware of. Basically, our brains are these like great pattern-finding machines, and so when you cover something up, for example, like when you're driving down the road and a sign is partially obstructed by a tree, you know, your mind works to put the pieces together and try to figure out like what the sign says. And so this is the same thing that's happening here. It's like, oh, it must be a circle because I'm seeing different parts, and it creates this illusion of magnification. Yeah, so a lot of my work does this. I try to use wonder as a tool to challenge complacency. This is a really simple card that I made for my friends around the holidays, which doesn't actually resemble a holiday card at all. But paper never forgets how it was bent, so I was able to use that material memory to essentially program it and guide people through the experience without including any instructions at all. So when you get this card, when you first pick it up, it's clear that it wants to bend in these very specific ways. And people discover that bending the card brings them through this simple story. And as you can see, it's a story about itself. The card is literally a 4-frame documentary about receiving this card. So I like this project because it's just about as simple as the material can get. This is the front and back of an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. It's printed on both sides. It has about 10 cuts and 2 glue dots. And yet it works in this way where it's like, I made it, but I still don't completely understand how it works mechanically and structurally. And this is actually the same feeling I get when I do all graphic design work. Even very, very traditional graphic design work, like branding and menu design. Aesthetically, it may work, but there's still a lot of questions I have about that. So this is a menu system in branding that I worked on for Russ & Daughters on the Lower East Side. They're a 105-year-old bagels and lox institution. If you're in from out of town, I would highly recommend going there. But, you know, it was one of those things where it felt less like I was controlling it and making decisions and more like I was interrogating it. I kept on playing with it, you know, like wondering why one font worked better than another, why one column layout worked better than another, why white paper rather than craft. I think this menu actually went through like 85 different revisions until it felt like it was done. So with this project, like with all graphic design, I feel like it's more like I'm surfing on a system of knowledge that I can't hold in my head in its totality at once, rather than being like a professional yielding certain expertise. So, you know, it totally gives me imposter syndrome. But the more work that I do and the more that I read about how work in other experimental fields moves forward, the more that I realize that this is like right where I want to be and right where I want to stay. There's really 2 entry points in understanding the world. There's this already formalized knowledge. Hold on. There we go. There's knowledge that's already been formalized, essentially being transmitted from one person to another. This, for example, is one way of understanding a Mobius strip. But for anyone who has ever made a Mobius strip, you can basically take a strip of paper, twist it once, tape the ends together, and start drawing a line down the middle, and you'll find that that line ends in the same place where it began. So I show this example because it's one of those things that makes a whole lot more sense in paper than on paper. And really, I think a surprising lot of the world is this way. You know, as with the Mobius strip, as with graphic design, as with love and comedy, the fact that it works is all the proof that's required to continue moving forward and testing it. And as soon as it becomes formalized knowledge, as soon as you turn it into an equation or a formula, it dies like just a little bit. So, you know, outside of the field of graphic design, there are many people who are opening unsolvable problems up to touch and to tinkering. For example, there's this group at MIT that's led by Eric Demain that's translating unsolvable folding and unfolding problems in science and engineering into origami of all things. And if you're interested in this, Nova's Origami Revolution on PBS, it's online. It's very interesting. An example of this is, by what pattern should airbags best be folded up within your steering column to most rapidly unfurl upon impact, which is like an ongoing pursuit. Or protein sequence come folded. So like, what is the fewest places that you need to cut a folded protein sequence so that the majority of the sequence like stays intact once it's unfolded in a linear form? So by making these problems tangible, the researchers are accessing this, superpower, really, of human tangible intuition. And in my own work, I realized that I can get much farther in thinking about complexity and engaging with complex problems if I can find a way to get my brain and my hand to work in tandem. So I end up translating a lot of complex things into toys. For example, as a freelance designer with an abundance of first world problems, I feel very overwhelmed by the problem of like, should I say yes to this job or should I say no to this job? And so instead of like making that decision and having like an existential breakdown every time, I decided instead to make a paper calculator that would decide for me. In this format, it's called a Vovell. Before there were computers or even calculators, there was still this need for calculation. And so people would do things like, take out their phone calculator when faced with a problem of like, all right, I want 15 bushels of asparagus to harvest in the fall. How do I do that? So like, I turn the Vovell to 15. It tells me how many seeds to get, when to plant it. These things are fun because they're kind of like the apps of the 1800s. Like they did one calculation really well, so you needed like an entire drawer of them to like get through life. But they're super fun because they make these proportions and the math physical. So everything on a Vovell is done through this series of nested and cut wheels. The back has to have like all of the answers. Like it can't generate something that it doesn't already know. So it's kind of, the design of it is a process of winnowing down the entire field of answers to the one answer that you're looking for. So on mine, which I call the existential calculator, somewhat jokingly, but really seriously, it's programmed with social science research about what makes people happy in work and feel secure, and what ends up leading them to a midlife crisis, which basically boils down to four main considerations. Working conditions, whether you're getting snacks or working in a dungeon, whether the work's good for the world or you feel like it's bad, if it's a good fit for you, and then how much money you're making. So you answer those four questions by turning the wheel to the most appropriate answer, and then your combination of answers yields a colored dot in this little window thingy thing. And then you flip it over to the back and find your color, and you trace it out to the outer edge, and all of the conditions you cross are ones that apply to you. So, if you end up in the red zone, this is like unrealistically good work. It's great for the world. It's a perfect fit for you. You're making tons of money. And the wheel's kind of making fun of you because it's like, oh, you might touch the void. So the whole thing is like, wherever you end up in the spectrum, it's going to make fun of you a little bit just because, we all feel self-conscious about work. But it's really not that different than taking an online quiz, but in this analog form, you can't help but look out over the entire spectrum of work, and if you're unhappy where you are, wonder about how you could get to the other places. And so it really facilitates this philosophical conversation with oneself, where you're constantly like flipping it over and saying like, all right, well, what if I change the money thing a little bit? What if I change this? So yeah, it's kind of like an aid to thought in a way. So currently in my work, this is the generative question that keeps on leading me to more and more projects. Why are lo-fi things appealing in a world of advanced tech? And I started thinking about this question seriously a while ago. Back in 2011, some friends of mine approached me to make a wedding invitation for them. And since we were all obsessed with music, we wanted to make a card musical. And I ended up making this card that ended up going viral and I was really surprised about it. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that story. So rather than taking design inspiration from a design blog or some normal source, I got my design inspiration solely from this guy, Mr. Wizard. Me and Karen and Mike, the bride and groom, had all been obsessed with this show when we were little kids, and we remembered one experiment in particular that we wanted to model the wedding invitation after. And it's this one. What he did was he rolled up a cone of paper, he taped it shut, he taped a needle to the end of it, and voila, it was a record player. I remember seeing this, and it totally blew my mind. And the idea of sending all of Karen and Mike's friends, you know, little record players that they could play with rather than like grown-up respectable invitations just seemed really super appealing. So we all got super excited that this was going to happen. And then the onus was on me to figure out how to actually make it work. So I started like wandering around Manhattan collecting needles, like going to the sewing district, getting all the sewing needles, going to Chinatown and buying up all the acupuncture needles, calling paper suppliers and trying to find the paper with the best audio properties. Meanwhile, the bride and groom were writing this really adorable song inviting guests to the wedding. And we put it onto a flexi-disc, which is a flexible acetate record. And the reason we did this is so that we could get a completely clear one. I printed the couple in black here. Everything you see behind it in color is like the backing page. In that way, when you rotate it every 90 degrees, it like completes the couple in a different scenario. So here they are playing music together and eating and drinking and being merry, and then growing old together in old person clothes. And this was a design decision that was like solely born out of fear, because even though I had tested all of the components, of course everything, all the materials, the final materials were getting in at the last second, and I was like so worried that like, you know, perhaps my sewing needle wasn't representative of the rest that I had ordered, or perhaps the grooves on the flexi-disc were going to be cut a little bit differently than what I was testing. So by making it a complete the picture game, there was actually some design justification built in beyond it being a functional record player. But it did work, and this is how it works. There are instructions to fold this piece of paper in half and sort of tent it up, and there's a needle on the little red dot, and you place it on the record and then turn it at 45 RPM. This is what the real song sounds like. Contrast. Yeah, so thanks. Yeah, so it was the funniest thing. Like, we were so happy that it worked and we hadn't just like wasted hundreds of dollars on materials, but we uploaded it to the internet and people were crazy about it. Like, it was like on Oprah and daytime TV and all of this stuff, and I was like, we are all sitting around complaining about like Spotify not having some obscure album and how like, you know, why isn't there a FLAC for me to download? I don't want a crummy MP3. And that thing, like, it sounds terrible. It's like definitely not in stereo. You know, it's like the kind of like the worst thing. So it's like, what is going on here? Why are people so excited about this? And so this was the interesting generative question I stumbled into and started to pursue. And I realized that there's this weird dimension in our relationship with our things that modern tech largely doesn't provide. Modern tech gives us what we want, you know, whatever we ask for. It, you know, eases the burden on humanity. This is a paper stack cutter at a printer down the street from me, which I think is hilarious. It's like, it's literally turning back time, because you don't have to cut each piece of paper yourself anymore. And I think the thing, after thinking about this for like years, that modern tech doesn't do is it's black box. It doesn't make information bioavailable to us in the same way. So Brett Victor writes about how the scatter plot graph was this great invention of humankind, because if you have a bunch of oops, sorry, I need to go forward. If you have a bunch of numbers in a spreadsheet, you can't just like feed this into the human brain and have it make sense. But as soon as you take those same numbers and put them on a map, it opens them up to our spatial reasoning, which we've developed, over thousands and thousands of years of evolution. And all of a sudden, we can see patterns and relationships in the numbers that were invisible before. So, the superpower helps us intellectually feel our way through the world. And I think intellectually, we think about the world much more through our bodies and through touch than it's acknowledged. The nervous system doesn't just end with the brain alone. It extends all the way to the skin. So like all information, not just the touchy-feely stuff, even technical information flows in through our senses. We're simply hardwired to have this very deep and rich intellectual and philosophical life through our tangible exchanges with our things. So when old mechanical tech was fussy and glitchy and sometimes didn't work and you had to move the antenna around or like unstick the little panels on the clock, it's frustrating, but it gave us this and reinforced this connection point to the larger physical world all around us. So as an artist, like I've really internalized this in my work. Whenever I work on any kind of project, even an animation project that's always going to be behind a screen, I always think about touch. I try to get the viewer's sense of touch involved by having noise, by showing the seams, so they can interact with all of these little palimpsests of how they were made and, kind of be there in a way that you can't when it's a completely clean digital experience. Yeah, like when I made this bird animation for my friends at Tiny Bob, it was like, aren't you going to remove the strings? And I was like, no, the strings are awesome because, it's like everyone's flown a kite before. And it's like my hand is sort of a stand-in for yours, the viewers, when I move this across. It just gives you this like sympathetic connection point to what's happening. Which is why people were super into this. It's like in science class, we learned about how sound is vibrations that move molecules in the air. It travels into your eardrums, and our brain registers it as sound. But until you put your hand on this thing and start moving it around and can syncopate those sounds with what's happening, it really drives it home. So as a designer, my most recent projects, they try to withhold judgment about what's signal and what's noise and just give people these open-ended experiences where they can play with these abstract things. So over the past couple of years, I've been teaching myself paper engineering. And so far, 2 projects have come out of this. I made this book as a camera, which is actually a super literal title. It's a paper camera and a pop-up book that you can load photo paper into the back and take photos with it by lifting up this dark slide, which allows light to come in through a pinhole and hit the paper in the back. And then you can go back in the dark and develop it in instant coffee and baking soda. So it's kind of like this, I'm stranded on a desert island kind of photography without any technology at all. But it actually makes pretty cool photos because they're so large format. So this one is on top of the Whitney Museum, and then this one's on the Brooklyn Bridge. And I published it myself a couple years ago and was like super worried that I'd have like 4,000 of these like hanging out in my closet forever. But the Museum of Modern Art like republished it recently. And so, yeah, hopefully you'll see more people looking super cool in public places while everyone else is using their smartphone. Thanks. I'm over time. This is the last project I'm going to show you, and then I'm going to go so other people can talk to you. But this one is called This Book is a Planetarium, and it's another super literal title. So if anyone has like a murder mystery they're writing and needs to like ruin it, like come talk to me. I'm the queen of literal titles. And there's a planetarium in it, but there's also some other stuff. The whole point of this book is to reduce various tech gadgets down to just paper. So when people are interacting with it, they're not interacting with something black box. They're not interacting with an interface or someone's idea about how technology should work. They're interacting more directly with these forces that undergird all physical experience in the universe. So it kind of explains that.
Standing there alone, the ship is waiting, all systems are go. I sure.
Yeah, so the whole goal with, oh, thanks. I'm gonna skip ahead because I'm really going long. The whole point of making that book is to like get people to ask questions themselves. And so, you know, by saying this book is a planetarium, I want people to be like, no, it's not, you know, and then walk over and be like, yeah, there is actually a planetarium site. And then when it works, to ask why. And so there's an explanation on every page explaining the basics of like how light, time, and sound work. Very basics, but enough to start Googling it. Yeah, so I wanted to just tell you that there's a URL called cutfoldtemplates.com where I have like the templates of a lot of paper stuff that you can build along with demos. And then this is my little chart about where my inspiration comes from. So these are my favorite lo-fi magic things. And I would also be remiss to tell you that I'm going to be hanging out at the after party from 5:30 to 8 with a little booth, and I'll have books because I've been standing here talking about how like touch is awesome, and then I showed you this visual show, so you can come by and play with books. And if you want to buy one, you can. And I'll be doing a signing, and yeah, I think that's it. Thank you all so much.